Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. We have a new month and there's new clubs from Spellbinders. So this is the Spellbinders January 2025 clubs. We have a clear stamp set. I have a lot of things here. I'm not going to share them all with this video. This here is the wax seal, and instead of wax beads, you get an organizer set. This is the layer stencil of the month. And then we have our 3D embossing folder of the month. I absolutely love that pattern. And our embossing folder of the month. A little hard to see on the video, but you'll see me using it in my next video. Then we have our glimmer of the month, our stitching die of the month, and then the die of the month, and then a large die of the month. So for this video, I'm going to focus on the glimmer of the month, the stitching die of the month, the die of the month, and the large die of the month. And then my next video is going to be using all of the other things. I am going to be pulling in the embossing folders for this to add some texture to the backgrounds, but I won't be doing anything unique or different with them. I'm just going to be using them to emboss paper to add texture. Finally, this is the Better Press of the month. It has press plates as well as dies. And this is the bonus caboodle item. It's a layering stencil for coloring in those press plate images. So those will also be used in the next video. That Aura Glimmer foil comes with the Glimmer of the month. Aura is one of my favorite ones. I'm not usually a gold fan, but I love this one because it has that holographic shine to it. So I'm going to start off by doing my hot foiling. I have my glimmer machine warming up here, and I'm putting my glimmer onto my glimmer plate onto the glimmer machine. I have a piece of the Aura foil cut here. I have an old roll of it, so I'm just using that up before breaking into the new roll. Once my glimmer machine is warm and that green light is on, I put the glimmer foil with the pretty side down, as well as my Hammermill Cardstock on there and the plates, and put the timer button on. It goes on for about a minute. Once that stops flashing, I can put it through my Platinum 6 machine to do the hot foiling. You need both the heat and the pressure for hot foiling. Anytime I'm doing hot foiling, I like to do solid hot foiling at the same time, use up that remaining foil. It's much easier even if I don't use it on my project, to store it on the cardstock, the pattern on the cardstock, than the foil itself, because the foil itself is quite flimsy. So I always like to do them all at the same time so that it's totally done. For this video, I am going to use the solid hot foil. I'm going to use it for a matte behind my foiled image. For this foiled image, I'm going to color it with some Prismacolor pencils. I'm using 902 Ultramarine and 901 Indigo for the image piece. And then for the background, I'm using 1063 50% cool gray and 1065 70% cool gray, just to add some shadow behind it. I thought it would look interesting if the image was colored in one color and then had some shadow behind it. The darker of the two blues I'm using to add shadow for wherever these cords, or whatever you want to call them, go behind another one. So I'm just going to add a little bit of shadow to give it a little bit more visual depth. So I'm not going to show all of the coloring on the video because it's very repetitive, and I do the same thing for the whole piece. I color all of the cord looking things with the lighter of the blues, and then I go in with that dark blue anywhere that cord goes underneath another to add that shadow. And then for my grays for my background, I start with the lighter of the two grays and then just add a little bit of a deeper gray where it's closest to those cords. Now when it comes to blending it, I'm using a paper stump and some Gamsol, and I'm going to start with blending the grays first. That way, when I go to blend the blues, I know that it's not going to affect the blue that much. I do have a piece of sandpaper off to my side that I can use on the tip of the paper stump if I find that I have any color on there that I want to get off. But it's easiest if I do all of the same color first and then move on to the next color. So I'm starting with the gray. I start where the color is closest to the edge. That's where the darkest of the color is. And I just blend it out. It's really, really easy to do. There's not really any technique to this other than dipping your paper stump into the Gamsol and blending the color out. It's so easy to do. I do have a piece of scrap paper to my side that I can tap my paper stump on if I feel like it's getting a little bit too wet. But I find that I start doing that and then I realize how much of the Gamsol is on the paper stump, and I don't find that I ever have anything pooling or out of control when I'm doing my blending. So I tend to stop doing that. Once I have all of that gray done, I'm going to work on the blue. Now I did my colors here very, very simple. I just did gray and blue. You could go and do a bunch of different colors for these cords. I think that would look fantastic as well. And I just really like how that shading gives it a little bit more of a dimensional look to it. So once I have that background completely done, I'm ready to start blending in my blues. And I would start with the darker of the two with the shading. And I'm doing all of that darker area first. And then I'm going to clean the tip off of my stump, making sure that I don't have too much color left on there. And I will start blending in the lighter of the areas. This way I'm working as quickly as possible, and it takes a lot less time rather than having to clean off my paper stump and just work on one cord at a time by doing all of the dark blue first, taking off any excess color, and then I do use the sanding paper just to make sure that I don't have any darker color left on there. I can go in and do all of that light blending all at once. And it's really easy to see how it changes while I'm doing that blending. The color seems to intensify, and that Gamsol will evaporate on its own. So your paper isn't wet once it's done evaporating. This is an easy way to color in foiled images, and that Gamsol or the Prismacolor pencils, they don't affect that foil at all. It doesn't change in any way, so we're not having to be careful with that foil. We can color it very quickly, very easily, and get through that entire image. And you can even do like florals like with this. Any foiled image you can color easily like this, and then depending on what colors you have a whole array of different color possibilities basically, and it creates just a gorgeous look to it. I love, like I said before, the look of the shading. It gives it some nice visual dimension. Once I have this completely finished, I can trim it down and start assembling my card. Now I'm keeping this card very, very simple. The thing that took the longest was the coloring, and even then it didn't really take too long. I just wanted to keep it very simple. I foiled my sentiment at the same time because that Glimmer plate of the month does have sentiments with it, but you could leave that sentiment off, do a foiled sentiment on a different piece of cardstock, die cut it, and have it layered on there just to give it a little bit more dimension, a little bit more interest. When it came down to trimming it down, I was paying attention to how I was trimming it, and I wanted to try as much as possible to have the lines from the solid hot foiled piece match up kind of closely to the lines on my foiled image piece, and it worked out really, really well. They're not exactly perfect, but they're really, really close. That way you don't have to worry about the fact that that solid hot foiled piece is not necessarily completely solid. It has those lines in it, but it carries over the theme from the front of the card. I'm gluing everything together with Barely Art glue. I have it in a nice fine line bottle. I love using this glue because it gives you a little bit of time to shimmy it in place, make sure that it's all layered properly, and then it starts to set fairly quickly. For my second card here, I'm using the die of the month, which is this beautiful Dragonfly. Apologies when the camera gets wiggly. I am doing this during Christmas holidays, and I have a lot of family at home, and we have an older house, and if they happen to walk upstairs while I'm doing this downstairs, then the camera starts to wiggle and I can't really control that. And it doesn't happen often, but it is annoying when it does happen. So for my butterfly wings, I want them to have a little bit of iridescence to them, so I'm using some solar paste. I have Crocodile Tears and Beluga here. The first thing I wanted to do is do some transparent-ish wings. So I have some vellum here. I'm using the green one first and then the blue. I also have some pieces of cardstock that I have die cut for the body of the dragonfly, and I'm using both blue and green on the different pieces of that. So I have the bottom layer of that body die cut out of black. I have the top layer of that body die cut out of some Cosmic Sky cardstock, and then just the little headpiece is die cut out of Peridot cardstock. And by adding that solar paste over top of those colored cardstocks, it adds that iridescent shimmer to it. Now, vellum doesn't like the moisture of the solar paste, so it's going to wrinkle and it's going to roll up on you. I will let it roll up for just a few minutes, and then once it has kind of started to set, I will lay it flat and I'll use my sticky mat to do it so that it helps it to dry a little bit faster and it doesn't dry on itself. For the mats for my card, I have a piece of black cardstock here that I trimmed down to 4 1/8 by 5 3/8, and my white piece is trimmed to 4 inches by 5 1/4. I'm using some of the crocodile tears around the edges of the black just to tie in that iridescent shine from my dragonfly. You're only going to see a tiny little bit of this, but I still wanted to see that iridescent shine. I absolutely love it. For my image piece, you could leave it flat if you wanted, but I thought it would be a good time to bring in the 3D embossing folder of the month just to add a little bit of texture and interest to that background. So I try to center it in my embossing folder just so that the pattern lines up with on itself. And then I run it through my Platinum 6 machine using the 3D embossing folder stacking. This is the perfect way just to add a little bit of texture to the background of that card. And I absolutely love this 3D embossing folder. The pattern of it, I really love that look to it. Now, to give it just a little bit of extra interest, I'm adding some of the Beluga solar paste. This is the blue one, and I'm just trying to add it to the raised edges. If you happen to press down a little bit too hard, it's going to go on the recessed areas, and I'm not too worried if it does that, but I am trying to, as much as possible, keep it on the raised part. Another option here would be to use a flat blending foam, but I do find that my fingers work just as well. And you'll see that I take some out of the container, tap it onto my work surface just to get the excess off of my hands so that I can control it just a little bit better. Once I get a feel for how much my hands or my finger is picking up from the jar, you can go straight to the background, but I do find that by tapping off the excess, I have a little bit more control. Once that vellum is completely dry, I can die cut the solid part of the wings. This die set has 3 different wing pieces. There is an outline piece, there is this piece here that I am using, and then there's one that has some stripes to it. And I don't use the other part, the one with the stripes in it, in this video. I just use this solid part as well as the black outline one, and it's got some really nice lines in it for those wings. I'm going to glue this together with that Barely Art glue. This is where that fine line bottle really comes in handy because I can dot that glue around the back of that black outline die cut, place it onto my wing, and then I'm going to put an acrylic block on top of it. This is just going to keep it nice and flat, make sure that it stays nice and flat while it's drying, especially with that vellum, because that vellum likes to curl with anything that has moisture to it. It's just going to help that just a little bit more. And I love the look of the solid black outline with that solar paste on the vellum. Now, I didn't put any solar paste on these black die cuts because I wanted to see the difference between that black cardstock and the iridescent shine on that vellum. But you certainly could, if you wanted to add some iridescent shine to this, you could absolutely put a little bit of that solar paste on this die cut. Another option would be to put it on the cardstock before die cutting. And really, it's a little bit easier to put the solar paste onto a solid piece of cardstock than it is to put on a die cut. Both are possible. It just depends on the look or the ease with which you want to do it. When I was doing my die cutting here, I hadn't really thought about putting that solar paste on the solid parts, but once I had started putting it on the vellum, I just kind of figured it went with the whole look that I was going to be going for. While waiting for those wings to dry, I layered on the pieces for the body so that that could dry at the same time. And now with those things ready, we're ready to start assembling the card. So I'm going to add the mat first, putting that acrylic block on top of there just like before so that it stays nice and flat. And then I can put my embossed piece on here. Now I trimmed down this white piece and then embossed it. And what I found with this video as well as my part 2 video is that when you do that, it does shrink the paper a little bit more from top to bottom than side to side. So my mat isn't absolutely perfect all the way around. I'm not too worried about that, but if you wanted it to be perfect all the way around, I would suggest taking a piece of cardstock that's a little bit larger and then embossing it and then trimming it so that you can control the side or the finished size of it. With my card base and my embossed piece glued down, I can assemble my dragonfly here. I'm just putting a little bit of that glue on the tip or the bottom part of the wing, the base of the wing, and then putting it under the body. And I don't really need to wait for it to completely dry. I will wait for that glue to set just a little bit, and then we can put it onto our card base. Now I'm going to glue both the wings as well as the body down, but you could also just glue the body down and then have the wings up a little bit. Once I have that done, I have the hello from this die cut, and I die cut it out of the Cosmic Sky cardstock as well as the black. I wasn't sure which one was going to look best, and I ended up choosing the black one because it went with the black part of the wings as well as the black cardstock that's around the outside. But really either one would have worked. The last step here is to use some glossy accents. I put it on the little beady part of the eyes as well as some of the sections down the body, and then let that completely dry. And it's going to go from like a milky look to a completely clear and dimensional shiny look. And it just gives it a little bit of extra and different texture. For the next card, I'm using the large die of the month. This is a beautiful Botanical aquarium. I have my florals. I'll die cut out here. These ones that I'm putting on my sticky mat are die cut out of Dahlia cardstock. My leaves and foliage are die cut out of Sage cardstock. And then I have some small flowers that are die cut out of some pink sand cardstock and some butterflies out of Purple Mist. To add some visual dimension, I'm just going to use some Distress ink to add a little bit of ink blending to the base of the foliage as well as the base of the petals. So for my greens here, I'm using some Rustic Wilderness. For my flowers, I'm using some Worn Lipstick. And then I'm going to die cut a piece of white cardstock to go behind that Botanical aquarium. There is a solid outline die cut there, and I'm going to do some ink blending on that with Hickory Smoke Distress ink, just to give it, like I said before, a little bit of visual dimension. Just makes it look a little bit more interesting. I'm using Spellbinders large blending brushes for those florals, and then I just have a regular ink blending brush for this white piece here. You don't necessarily have to add the shading to this part, but I just thought it would give it a little bit more of a dimensional look. Now the cover of this die has the florals on the inside of the aquarium behind the lattice part. I chose to put it on the outside. Now I didn't put anything on the inside of this aquarium, but I think it could be really nice to have, say, candles in there. You could have some florals in there, some florals on the outside. You could have, say, a bird die cut in there. I think there's a lot of things that you could put in this Botanical aquarium to give a bunch of different looks. With all of my ink blending done, I'm ready to start assembling my die cuts. For the centers of my florals here, I have some pieces die cut out of Lunar Gray and some die cut out of black. To me, they looked a little bit like poppies, so that's what I went with when I was choosing my colors. And I love the fact that there is one die cut that is head on of the floral and one that has a side view of it. So it gives you a little bit more variety than just individual flowers that have one look to them. So this side view has some petals that get layered onto the front of it. So I'm using that same Barely Art glue to glue those down. Now I'm just gluing mine down flat for this, but you could, if you wanted, use your fingers to curl those petals just to add a little bit of extra dimension to it. I didn't do that for this card simply because I figured I was layering all these things together anyway, so it was going to have some dimension anyways. But that is a great way to add a little bit of extra dimension by curling those petals. One of the foliage or leaf stems have little dots on the end of them, and that's where these smaller flowers are supposed to go. So I have a little dot of glue on there, and I'm just using a jewel picker to pick up those die cuts and place them on the ends there. I'll let that dry for a few moments. Once I have my pieces or my die cuts on the front of my card, I am going to put some stickles in the center of those flowers just to give them a little center as well as to give them a little bit of sparkle. You could also use something like liquid pearls or Nouveau drops just to add that center of the floral as well. Now I'm ready to assemble my card, so I'm going to glue down that solid background to my Botanical aquarium first. I have the front piece here die cut out of Silver Pearl cardstock, and this is from the Silver Treasured cardstock pack. I use it often in my videos. I love the fact that there are 5 different finishes here, so you can pick and choose which works best for the project that you're creating. And I've been using this cardstock pack as well as the gold and rose gold for 6 months, and I'm just starting to get to the point where I'm running out of some of the different cardstocks, so they go a really, really long way. Once my botanical aquarium is glued down, I can start putting my die cuts on the front of it. Now, just like before, I used my acrylic block to hold everything down nice and flat, but while that block is down there, I will start doing my arrangement on top of it and get the look that I want. And that way, when I lift it up and move it to the side, I don't lose that. I still have that, and I can just start to glue my die cuts down. And when I do glue those die cuts down, I start from the back to the front. So I will glue down some leaves and foliage that are in the back, making sure to keep the space for the ones that are going to be in the center of my arrangement. And I have a bunch of different florals here that I'm just using all together, mixing and matching. And if any of those die cuts are a little bit too big or too long, I can just take the bottom of it, clip it off, or rip it off. And typically I'll just tear it with my fingers, because those bottom stems or whatnot are behind other things. You're not going to see that, but it's a great way to customize those die cuts and get a little bit of a different look out of them. By having, say, that floral spray, by dividing that second one in half, I can spread those florals out, and it just gives it a look that's not completely repetitive, and it makes it look a little bit more unique. Then I have my side florals here that I'm adding, and then we have some larger petals, or sorry, larger leaves with the foliage. I'm going to put that behind my larger one in the center. Now, for this center one, I'm not using my fingers to curl it at all, because those petals are all attached. It would look a little bit odd. So I'm just gluing that down nice and flat. I still only put the glue in the center so that if I have anything that I want to tuck behind it, that I don't have any glue in the way. Once I have all my florals down, I can take those butterflies and I can glue them down. To add a little bit of texture with that, I will fold them in half at the body and just put glue down the center of that butterfly, so that it has a little bit of visual dimension to it, and those wings pop up a little bit. There's two butterflies in this set. There's a larger one and a smaller one. I've die cut the smaller one twice so that I have an odd number of butterflies, and I can place them around the card. Last step, as I mentioned before, is to add some stickles. So I'll add them to the center of those light pink flowers, little bit on the edges of my butterfly wings, and then I'm putting them in the center of my poppies, just dotting them a little bit, just to add that little bit of texture and that little bit of sparkle. And it ties all of those florals in together because they're on several different ones. Once I have that stickles down, I'll let that completely dry, and here is the final result. Now, I didn't add any embossing to this card because I thought there was going to be enough to it, but you certainly could emboss the background just to add that extra little bit of texture. For the last card, I'm using the stitching die of the month, and it has this beautiful ladybug in it. I didn't want to do a red ladybug because I didn't think it was going to go with the rest of the cards that I was creating. So I chose to die cut my ladybug as well as two of the sentiments that come in this set with pink sand cardstock. And I'm using that worn lipstick distress ink to add a little bit of ink blending to it with some Spellbinders blending brushes. This is just going to give it a little bit darker look, a little bit more closer to red, but it's also going to add that visual dimension. And I do this ink blending before I start doing my stitching. Now, I didn't want to have too many different colors in this, so I chose to do all of my stitching with silver floss. So I have some silver floss on my needle here. Anytime I'm using the stitching dies, I like to put my needle through my cardstock from the back to the front. Then I use a little piece of Best Ever Craft tape, and I tape that thread end in place and then do the rest of my stitching. The holes are big enough so that it's really easy for that needle to go through. I did find on the wings, once I was getting closer to the end, that center hole was getting a little bit filled with all that floss. It was doable, but I did find it started getting a little bit tighter towards the end. But I'm doing silver floss on all of the different die cuts for this, so that's going to add a little bit of continuity to it. I have that oval ring there to frame my ladybug, and that has stitching holes in it as well, and that will be done out of silver floss as well. And that is die cut out of that same silver pearl cardstock that I die cut my botanical aquarium from. So that's going to coordinate with that card as well. I am not doing all of my stitching on screen because it's fairly repetitive, and it's really intuitive to know exactly where that floss goes. When you do the die cutting for this, there are little grooves or little indentation marks put on your die cut piece, so it shows you exactly where that floss is intended to go. You can always get creative and change it up if you want, but for anyone that is starting out or beginning, it's a great way to do it because you don't have to guess where they intended for you to put it. You know exactly where it's supposed to go. So I have one of my wings stitched there. I'll do the other one off screen because it's exactly the same as the first one. This here is the part of the ladybug head. The stitching pattern is exactly the same as the wings. There's one central hole and the stitches radiate out from it towards the outside edge. And just like before, I use that Best Ever Craft tape to tape down my floss end. And then once I'm done stitching, I will tape it down on the other side, and then I'll use my scissors to trim it. So it's going to hold that floss in there. Most of my die cuts for this, I do die cut them twice so that I have a second one to glue underneath that first one. I don't do it for all of them with this because I didn't want to add that extra layer to some of the die cut pieces, but I do find that by having that extra layer beneath it, when you're going to glue these pieces together, it does make it a little bit easier because we're gluing it to cardstock rather than gluing it to floss. If you wanted to not have that set or have that extra piece in there, that extra step, you definitely can eliminate it, but I would wait a little bit longer for your die cut pieces to dry on the floss because of that extra dimension. And I do find it works or it's helpful to have that acrylic block to put on top of those die cuts when they are drying, just to make sure that that glue has contact with with the pieces below it so that it does create a strong adhered die cut, if that makes sense. So with these dots, again, I have an extra piece die cut. So once that is trimmed or once that is stitched, I glue down that die cut, and then I have these sewing clips that I'm using to hold those die cuts together to make sure that that glues in place and that I have everything nice and secure for when I'm ready to assemble my pieces. The next step here is to glue or to stitch this frame. So once again, I start on one end or at one point, tie or tape my floss down, and then do my stitching. And there's a line in the center of the stitching and then stitching radiating out from it. I'm using this silver floss here on the silver pearl cardstock, but I think it could also look really nice done with a green floss because the stitch pattern makes it look a little bit like vines. You can have a lot of fun with that. Again, I didn't want to add too many colors here, so I chose to just do my stitching with that silver floss rather than creating creating pieces with a ton of different colors. Once I have all my stitching done and I did the rest of it off screen, I'm ready to start gluing and assembling things together. So this oval piece here has 3 different pieces. There is an inner edge, an outer edge, and then the stitching piece in between. When I die cut that silver piece, I had everything taped together. When it came to die cutting my white piece here, I had all 3 pieces that I put on top of my white cardstock, taped the outer edge and the inner edge down, and then removed the second piece so that I knew that when I did that die cutting, I was going to have a oval that was the same as the one that I had die cut to do that frame. Now that that frame is done, I'm ready to start assembling my ladybug here. So I have the little antenna that I glued on. I glued it on the underneath side of this ladybug, but I think it's intended to be put between the base and then the stitched head part. For the final look, I don't think it really matters a whole lot because the silhouette is the same, and really your eyes focus on the stitched pieces. You don't really notice the antenna, or I didn't anyways. Then I'm ready to glue on the wings, and for the wings I only added a little bit of glue to the tip of them that was going to go underneath that head piece, and that way I have a little bit of dimension underneath those wings popping up a little bit, and it looks like the ladybug is kind of opening its wings, ready to start flying. Then I glued down the dots and set that aside to dry. For the background for this card, I'm just using the embossing folder of the month. This has just a random pattern all over it. It goes really well with all the different dies in the different clubs for this month. And it doesn't have really deep texture to it, but it does give that background a little bit of extra texture and a little bit of extra interest. The mat around here is die cut or is trimmed from Dahlia cardstock, and that is trimmed to 4 1/8 by 5 3/8. And my white embossed piece here is trimmed to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. using that Barely Art glue to glue it down. And once that is completely glued down and that glue has started to set, I'm ready to start adding the different die cuts. Now you can see how easy it is to use those sewing clips to hold everything. That way I'm not holding things while they dry. And once that's completely dry, I'm ready to glue that to the front of my card. And it's much easier, like I said before, to glue down the cardstock to the cardstock than having those stitches. It also gives a little bit of extra layers. With that frame glued down, I'm ready to glue down my sentiment. So the one I chose for this, the top says thank you, and then the bottom says so much. There's another option in the set, and the top would say a gift, and then the bottom would say for you. So you have a couple different varieties. The last step is to add the Ladybug to the center and then let that completely dry. And here is our final card. I love that combination and I love the look of that pink Ladybug. I think I'm going to have fun playing around with different colors for that Ladybug. That silver and that pink just work so well together. Next, we have our Botanical aquarium. It coordinates beautifully with that Ladybug card, and I love the dimension that we get from all those florals. I always love doing cards with florals. You can have so much variety. You can pick and choose different color schemes as well as ink blending them with different colors. Then our gorgeous Dragonfly card with that iridescent shine on the wings as well as the body, thanks to that solar paste. And you can have fun with different colors of solar paste as well. Lastly, we have our Glimmer of the month, where it is colored with the Prismacolor pencils, giving it some extra depth and visual dimension by the shading underneath there. So this is the first part of our clubs for January 2025. My next video is going to work with all the rest of the clubs that I have here. Thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate all the time that you spend with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.